And SR 29, and I'm going to turn that over to you. Do you have videos as well this morning? Okay, good. Okay, we got that on the second presentation. Very good. Senator Calzrich, Chairman Calzrich, you're on, and let's see. Which number is he?
Members for being diligent enough to show up at this hour in the morning to do people's business. If I may just I have two different resolutions that are asking the state of Georgia, our legislature, to make a request or an application of the United States Congress to hold an amendment convention of the states to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. I'll go through the process a little bit since it applies to both of these applications that I have for your consideration this morning. You know, you might ask, what is the state of Georgia's Government Oversight Committee dealing with federal issues like this? Isn't our job ordinarily to oversee the state of Georgia's government, you know, mind our own business, so to speak? But the United States Constitution is a very delicate balance of powers between the federal government and the state governments, and we are, a collection of states that banded together to govern each other. And in our Constitution, in Article 5, it provides for two different mechanisms for amending the United States Constitution. Our founders were really very wise and had quite a bit of foresight to realize that as times changed over the decades and centuries, there might be needs to amend our Constitution to match the times or to deal with different situations that might arise during the course of history. And the first is for the United States Congress itself, by a 2/3 vote, to propose amendments to the Constitution and then refer them to the states for ratification. And it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify any proposed amendment. And that's happened quite a few times in the history of the United States, where our Congress has, in fact, presented amendments to the states for ratification. And only if 3/4 of the states agree to it do we amend this grand document, our Constitution. There's an alternate method considered or presented or provided for in Article 5 is for the states themselves to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. And they do that by meeting in an amendment convention, each state being represented, to come up with the language or the proposed amendment. And then once again, if 2/3 of the states ask for such a convention, Congress must call it and allow the states to propose an amendment. If those states working together come up with a proposed amendment, it also has to be sent to the states for ratification, and it requires 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So it's just two methods for presenting or proposing amendments. These two presented before you today are issues that, in my opinion, it is extremely unlikely that the United States Congress will propose. And one reason is because they are both limits on the United States Congress's powers. And you all are sitting here in a position of power to vote, and you realize how unlikely it is that you would pass a bill or a vote that would limit your own ability to do your job, in your opinion, or put parameters around what you do. One thing we did last year that was quite unique is we cut our own pay 10% in response to this pandemic. When we were cutting the state budget by 10%, we as legislators said, you know, it's only fair that we share the pain with the rest of the state, and we cut our pay 10%. That is a unique situation. I've been here 14 years, and I hadn't seen it very often where we voluntarily limited our own pay or our power or our abilities to serve the people. Same thing would apply to the United States Congress. So if you look at the first resolution, 28, it deals with term limits on the United States Congress. This does not apply to the state of Georgia or your job in any way. It's the United States Congress, the representatives and senators. And so you can see pretty quickly it's unlikely that a sitting U.S. senator or sitting congressman is going to ask the people of the United States to limit their length of time they can serve in office. But we're at a time right now with really, and I think many people would share the view that we have dysfunction going on in D.C. Such extreme partisan bickering. We have such institutionalized, embedded politicians there that sometimes seem to be more worried about themselves and keeping their seats than serving us as people. And that's not the way Congress started. We had a citizen legislature in the United States Congress just like we do here in the state of Georgia when this country was founded. Farmers would leave their fields and they would go serve a 2-year term in Congress. It was not a full-time job originally. It was much like us, where they would meet only certain months of the year and do the people's business and then go back to their jobs. Well, it evolved over time into a full-time job where they live and breathe the political process, 24/7, so to speak, and these guys get dug in, guys and gals, and it is extraordinarily rare to see an incumbent be beat now. Part of the reason that is because of the fundraising disparity. Incumbents get the money. That's the safe bet for somebody wanting to influence legislation, is to support the incumbent, because over 90% of the time, the incumbent wins. It's rare to see a loss, and that's largely because of that fundraising leverage or advantage that they have. And what that ends up doing is giving the special interest groups outsized influence in policy passed by the United States government. When they develop these relationships with the sitting senators and congressmen, continuously back them, and you end up having a much narrower view of the world being presented. By imposing term limits, you do a couple of things. One is you limit these long-term fixtures in Congress by they go serve their length of term that the limit might end up being. And by the way, this bill does not specify a certain number of terms to be limited. That should be decided by the Convention of States as they are working out and negotiating and debating what limits should be proposed to put on congressmen and senators. There are a lot of people that say it ought to be 6 terms of 2 years or 2 Senate terms of 6 years each, so maybe 12 years is enough. I don't have a personal preference. I just think this subject matter needs to be addressed, so we need to decide, do we want to have permanent congresspeople and senators, or do we want them to go in saying, I'm going to go serve my country for no longer than a finite period of time, that we could amend the Constitution to put that limit. There are other people that want to speak to this resolution here today that have been devoted to this cause for many years, but from my perspective, I would just say that's the idea here, that states ought to be able to meet in a convention and propose an amendment to be ratified by 3/4 of the states that would designate what appropriate limits there should be on service in Congress, service in the United States Senate. Now, I'm going to sort of probably answer some of the questions if any of you get emails on this. There is what I believe to be a false narrative that if we let this genie out of the bottle, if we were to call such an amendment convention, that it could be a runaway convention, that we might revamp the entire United States Constitution, and why would we allow that to happen? There was really only one amendment convention. That was the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And these people that are naysayers on this and saying, well, be careful if you have this type of convention, it might get out of hand, are forgetting that the reason we had the original convention was because the Articles of Confederation were not working. We didn't have a mechanism to borrow money as a country. We didn't have the power, enough central government power to control trade with foreign nations or the relationships between states. And you'll remember the debate between federalism and states' rights even back then, and the grand compromise that was reached to have each state have 2 United States senators, to give the states an equal voice at the table, and then to have the United States Congress by population so that the people would be represented in equal proportions. That convention was called for the purpose of revamping our original Articles of Confederation so that we could reform our government in a way that it worked. And of course, that's where the Bill of Rights came from. You know, where those were the first amendments proposed. That was also part of the compromise. Folks were like, well, if we are going to submit ourselves, give more power to this federal government, then there's certain rights that we are, as people, are going to insist as citizens that these will be protected under this government, that all our little states are giving up a little bit of our own autonomy to do. So if you have people send you an email saying, careful, 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 you might create a runaway convention and change this country to a socialist country. Let me tell you 2 things to answer that. Number one, whatever amendment proposed by this convention of all 50 states would not immediately become an amendment to the Constitution. It would then be presented to the states for ratification. And you still would have to have 3/4 of the states in this grand United States agree on it before it became an amendment to the Constitution. The second thing is a provision in Georgia law that passed, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, when we were having some of these issues largely on the balanced budget issues, which were out of control then and have exponentially increased since then, was a bill we put in the state of Georgia called the Delegate Limitation Act, designed for the event if a amendment constitution is actually called. If 2/3 of the states all agree on a subject matter, they want to have a convention to propose an amendment, to negotiate out the terms and come up with the language of an amendment to give to the states for ratification. We have provisions in Georgia as to how our delegates are selected, but also it binds them that they do not have the authority to consider any issues other than those called for by our legislature. And that's one reason why in Senate Resolution 28, it's a single issue. This is calling for the United States Congress to call an amendment convention for that one sole issue to determine whether or not it's appropriate to propose an amendment giving term limits. And if we selected delegates and sent them to that convention, they are bound to consider only that one subject matter. And if they varied from that call, that charge that our legislature would give them, they may be recalled and replaced. So have no fears that by approving either one of these resolutions, you would open up Pandora's box for a free-for-all convention asking for more subject matters. So I'll come back around, if it pleases the chair, and speak of the balanced budget amendment once you're done with your consideration of this term limits proposal. So all this resolution does is it calls on the United States Congress to count us as a state as one of the states asking for an amendment convention for that one single purpose, to propose an amendment to limit the terms of service in the United States Congress. It takes 2/3 of the states, 34 states total, would have to send in similar applications to the United States Congress before such a convention would be held. I am not certain of the number that have submitted such applications yet. I believe it's between 18 and 20 states, so this would be adding to that total to get to 34. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions or to yield the
Let me just
podium.
in the essence of time, and we've got a pretty good list of people who want to
talk?
speak. Would
Okay.
you like to go ahead and address it, because it's the same platform except a different issue, correct?
Yes, sir. You want me to talk about?
If you will,
I'll
go
be
ahead
happy
and do
to.
that just in the
Okay.
issue of time. I think that's a wise decision.
Glad to.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so the other resolution is Senate Resolution 29. And this is a resolution doing the exact same thing, applying to the United States Congress to call an amendment convention under Article 5 to consider proposing a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. The terms of such a amendment would be determined by that group of all 50 states at a convention. I put in here specifically that this would have exceptions for responding to emergencies and national defense. And so it's kind of unique that here we are in a time of a national emergency, and we have seen the CARES Act and the relief packages that we have borrowed money, trillions of dollars, to help our people. That's in response to a national emergency. So this is a grand example that if we were to propose an amendment to balance the budget, it would have exceptions. And this is the type of exception you would have to respond to national emergencies and to provide for the national defense. Naturally, you would think that would be a time of war. If you look at the charts, and Mr. Chairman, I saw something in the Wall Street Journal this weekend that showed the United States budget deficit in proportion to our gross domestic product. And it is now over 100% of our gross domestic product is our debt. We're up in the, I want to say it's 26 to 28 trillion dollars in debt right now, which is just a crushing debt. It is the highest percentage ever in our history, including if you look at the graphs right after, or 1945 at the peak of World War II, when we were fighting literally to save the world from tyranny. That's an example. You got to borrow money to survive sometimes when it's in keeping your country from being invaded, when we've just been bombed in Pearl Harbor, et cetera. This gives exceptions for that, but otherwise, during normal times, live within your means. 49 out of 50 states require a balanced budget. We do. We live within our means here in Georgia. And just like last year, we had to cut spending because revenues went down. Right now, it's like happy times are here again. It feels like the budget's going up and we're able to increase spending. But that is fiscal prudence to only spend what you have. In your family budgets, you got your checkbook, you've got your budget. When you go home, you know how much your rent is, how much your car payment is, how much your groceries. You know, you don't spend more than you have, unless on occasion you might borrow money for a capital investment. The greatest example is your home, because you might not be able to write a check for $150,000 to purchase your home. You'd save your whole life to be able to buy one. So in these capital items, you buy them over time. Well, that's what we do here. You know, we're able to borrow. Our bond package is about $1 billion a year. We allow ourselves to spread out over time some of those payments, but on an annual basis, you know, we live within our means. I think we ought to put the same kind of guardrails or constraints on this country's budget, or our children are going to be living in a very different world than we are. They are going to be living in a world where either you devalue the dollar, where dollars are like yens, and it takes $1,000 to buy something that today you buy for 10. So all of us will then be poorer if you're making the same amount of money in doing that, or else we're not going to be able to borrow the money. Nobody's going to loan money to a country that doesn't have the reserves to pay it. We will be in quite a fix, or else just tax yourselves into oblivion to try to pay down this debt. So I see this as something that has just gradually deteriorated, and it's not a partisan issue. Republicans whined and moaned and complained about the Obama administration raised the national debt $5 trillion during his 8 years in office. Went from 11 trillion to 16 trillion or something. Well, look at here. The Republicans are now gone from 16 trillion to 28 trillion. You know, it's the pot calling the kettle black type situation. Whichever party is in control in D.C., unless we put limits on how much they can spend, will continuously spend whatever it takes to make people happy, to buy votes. Any of you serve on appropriations? How does it feel when everybody's coming to you begging for money and you don't have money? It is tough to say no. Is there ever a year we spend less than the budget revenue estimate that the governor gives us? Heck no. We spend every possible penny that we're allowed by law to spend because it makes folks happy. It helps provide it. And I'm not saying any of the spending's bad. You know, it's often, they're all good causes that somebody wants, but it's not responsible to dig yourself in a financial trap. So the balanced budget amendment portion is for the states to get together and decide the parameters and the terms of limitations on the United States government borrowing power. It doesn't have to, I mean, it can be like Georgia. You could borrow up to a certain percentage in any given year. You can definitely, spend more than you have to meet national emergencies or provide for the national defense. But we need some guardrails because it is out of control spending going on in D.C., and it will be to the detriment of our country. So both of these, I would hope that there would be two different conventions one day once 2/3 of the states agree. The balanced budget amendments believe that Georgia may be the 34th state that would trigger this. I'm not certain of that because there are some states that have passed an application asking for a convention, amendment convention, but they have rescinded them later. And there's a question, can you? I believe that you can change your mind and rescind it if we decide, well, no, we no longer need term limits or no longer need a balanced budget, and that would back you out of the 34 states. So there's a little question on a couple of them, but we're really, really close to 34 states, and I'll do my research and see exactly what the total count is now. But Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer questions about either resolution or to let the other speakers that desire to speak on either one of them have their
questions on the committee. Okay, I'm gonna start. Let me see, number one. All right, number one.
Good morning. And
Good
thank
morning,
you.
Senator.
You said we have 17 states already, 17 of the 34? Did I
Yeah.
get that right?
For term limits,
For
yes,
term
yes,
limits.
Senator.
And do you have a list of those 17?
I don't, but there's some speakers from the U.S. Term Limits organization that is working nationwide on this issue that could probably answer that a little more precisely than I can.
All right, and my last question is this a Alex ask?
No.
Okay.
That's actually a great question.
Oh, I know.
That is,
Oh, I'm sorry.
there is,
Serious.
this isn't coming from any organization like that, and it's an extraordinarily bipartisan project. I think there's been a lot of polling on this issue, and it is almost exactly equal people that identify as Democrats versus Republicans. It's about 85% of the public, regardless of party affiliation, agree that it's a good idea.
Okay. Senator Robertson.
Chairman Calzer, thank you.
Morning,
As
Senator.
always, great presentation. And when you talk about the balanced budget, my fear is that new baby Calzert and my 2-year-old daughter are going to be grandmothers in a country much, much poorer and desolate than you and I will live and die in. But do you think that you may solve the problem if the second resolution passes to require a balanced budget, that you basically eliminate your issue with term limits when congressmen and senators go to Washington knowing that the purse strings have been cut and that that parameters and guardrails have been put in, that they can't go up there and serve their special interests unfettered, and that they're not as valuable to the not the constituents, but the lobbyists and those special interest groups. So
Right.
with one having 34, if Georgia being the 34th, we may solve our term limit issue by passing that second resolution.
I think
First.
there may be some interplay between those two. I mean, what it's really like right now serving in the United States Congress is it's like having a credit card. You know, you get your paycheck, which is all of our tax revenue that comes in. You can spend that, but you've also got a credit card sitting over there. But unlike you and me, there's no limit on the credit card. This is like an Amex Black or whatever it is, where you just charge whatever you want. And as long as you're making people happy, they keep sending you back. So there could be an interplay. But, boy, there's a whole lot of other issues as well where people get embedded in D.C., not just spending our money, but setting policy. And the powers of some of the committee chairs up there just absolutely killing ideas and not allowing things to be debated or discussed is equally damaging.
Thank you.
Senator Robertson. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Senator Hickman, you are 11, I believe. Yes, sir. Got you. Senator Hickman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, thank you. That's a great presentation, and I learned a lot through it. Two quick questions. A little bit following back on Mr. Robertson, Senator Robertson. How many years, and maybe this sounds a little bit bad, but I'm going to ask a question anyway. What's the most years right now that anybody's serving in Congress?
Oh, Lordy. There is no limit, obviously, but
Right,
I
that's what
want
I'm
to
saying.
say there are people who have been there over 30 years now.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think most of us would agree that 30 years in any place is probably too long, other than marriage. The second thing, I agree with Senator Robinson on the budget situation. Help me understand that this proposed amendment is just putting the wording in place for a balanced budget. It's not giving a time frame for a balanced budget, because it's going to take some time to work through all this in order to get, because if we're this
No
far out
doubt,
of whack
yeah.
right now, it's not something you can correct in 2 years.
That's a question coming from the accountant in you, Senator.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, it would be like a drug addict going cold turkey to suddenly have to go from having trillion, we're a $2 or $3 trillion deficit this year, to go from 0 to 60 or 60 to 0 in that case overnight. I think any proposed amendment in the conversations I've heard would have a sort of a glide path, a gradual decrease, would be a target that this must be reduced within a certain number of years, instead of having devastating effects to certain programs that are kind of embedded at this time. And that sort of reminded me, Senator, some of your questions earlier, where'd this come from? Where I got engaged in balanced budget was at a National Conference of State Legislators event, which is, as we all know that attend those, extraordinarily bipartisan. In fact, I served on the board for some years, and we tried to keep an equal balance of Democrats and Republicans on the board of that organization. But there was a presentation one year at the National Summit, and there's a group called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force that was presenting this data. And we had a meeting and some follow-up meetings, and I've been engaged in that. But it has been a broad bipartisan support on both of these two issues. But that's the organization that it sprung from, rather than a more narrowly focused, we'll say, public interest group. But you're raising a great point there, that everybody recognizes you can't go from $2 trillion in deficit spending a year down to 0 without having some devastating effects, and it would need to be a gradual step down until you reach that goal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Jackson, you are on.
Hi, good
Hey,
morning.
Senator Jackson.
Thank you for bringing this forward. Can you name a time in the U.S. history in which we have not been engaged in war?
In your and my recent history, difficult, but yeah, there are a lot of times where
No, we've
had
only,
war.
in the history of the United States, we've only not been in war for 15 years out of the entire history of the United States. So your exception that we can have a deficit during times of war would essentially have enabled us to have had a deficit for basically the entire time that this country has been in existence. So that exception creates an avenue for us to continue to increase our deficit.
Well, that would, of course, be limited to the cost of that war. Now, a lot of these conflicts we were in were not enormously expensive, I'm sure. Some of them, boy, when we were in Kuwait and Iraq, I think they spent $1 billion there. But, I think the exception would be for the amount spent on that conflict or self-defense.
Sure.
And I guess it's how the states define it, too. The way this application does is for the national defense. We've had a lot of those wars you're speaking of that, we were not under attack. We were injecting ourselves in other places in the world. But that's a very smart point you raised.
Sure. May I ask another question?
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
let you.
Go right ahead. Go ahead.
I'm also curious about this notion of around term limits. I had some surgery at Piedmont Hospital, which I think is a teaching hospital, and so they told me that there would be a resident who would be doing surgery on my knee, but they said, don't worry, he's being supervised by someone who has 20 plus years of experience. and that gave me great comfort. So I am concerned about who's going to be supervising us freshmen when it comes time when term limits are put in place. That's my one question around that. And then, right now we are beholden to our constituents because they get to vote for us. If you're in the Congress, they vote for you every 2 years. They vote for you every 6 years if you're in the Senate. But if we impose term limits, then senators would have 6 years in, quote, a kind of lame duck session where they would not be accountable to any voter because they can't be voted for again. And so how do we keep track of those folks, and how do we hold them accountable when there's no election that will come afterwards?
Yeah. Well, of course, there could be recall petitions, that type of thing for one, but that is the balance that would need to be struck by the states as they worked through and proposed an amendment to take some of your points into consideration in determining what's the length of the term limits. Would it be 24 years, 12 years, 6 years, one term? That would be debated and agreed upon by the majority of our states, and then ratified by 3/4 of our states would have to agree. I've been here maybe longer than I should have. I've been here 14 years, and there is some value to institutional knowledge.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's amazing, I've got a couple of them senior to me here, but not many, is that I'm number 7 in seniority in the Senate. And so there are only 6 people with more than 14 years experience in the Senate. It's functioning pretty good in our view. Now, one thing, if you limit the length, it lets younger senators like you step up quicker. You're going to find a time here soon where you want to be a committee chairman. And if you got all these people stuck at the top, you're never going to have a chance if they're not living, as long as their voters like them. They're definitely going to have more money than the challenger to defend their seat. And unfortunately, when you're seeing these huge sums spent on campaigns these days, it make it harder and harder for the people to even have a fair shot at replacing somebody. But I recognize those are all great issues you bring, and I think that's something we would let the states work out. What's the appropriate balance?
Can I have one more final question?
One more, quickly. Thank you.
Yes. So the United States deficit has been increasing since 2000, essentially, for the last 20 years. Has there been any material change in the value of the dollar as our deficit has increased over the last 20 years? And has there been any material change in the quality of our life in the last 20 years as our deficit has increased?
I think those are, sort of subjective observations that different people would have different views on those things. I will say you're right. It's even longer back than 2000. 1992 was the last balanced budget in the United States government. Bill Clinton was president, and Republicans controlled Congress. And it came together bipartisan. We were able to make things do fine. Now, every time there's either a tax cut or a tax increase, Congressional Budget Office makes these projections. If y'all do certain things, you'll get it under control. It just doesn't happen, But I think there'd be universal agreement by economists that continuing to live at these levels, it's going to have some devastating financial impact. One thing that has allowed us to skate by here in the last decade is the very low interest rates. So the cost of servicing that debt has not been humongous. Now we're looking at almost 0 interest rates right now. If you get back just to his 5 to 6%. I've seen mortgage rates as high as 12% in my lifetime. I'm not that old. But think about how much exponentially our debt service would be as a percentage of our budget if rates, once they go back up, and now we're going to be paying it on a much, much more gigantic pile of debt. It's going to be where it starts eating into other programs and other spending necessities.
Let me kind of set I'll call it a platform of where I think we're at. We have a large list of people who want to speak on this as far as that, and we had limited them, I'm going to say to 2 minutes apiece. I had promised Senator Watson that I would hear his bill this morning, and I'm going to shoot for probably 8:50 if I can, as far as that portion, and then if you'll talk to Andrew with that, and then we'll kind of work our way from there. So if we've got our first speaker is Ken Quinn, and I'm going to ask him to give us to come in, and
Okay.
we'll get as many speakers as we can up to
Thank you, Mr.
12:50
Chairman, and
or up to 8:50.
I'm happy to stay as long as you need me today, or to come back if you need a follow-up meeting. I'm at your service.
Okay. I want to give people just to speak, and then how we do that. Okay. Thank you. All right. Ken Quinn, if you can come in.
Chairman, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are.
Hi. I don't know if you can see me or not. Good morning, everybody. Chairman Harbin, committee members. My name is Ken Quinn. I'm with U.S. Term Limits. I'm a regional director with the organization. I'm here in support of SR 28. And I'll keep this very brief. I hope you have copies of my testimony and corresponding documents. I'm going to just stick to the topic of the idea of this runaway convention. There's a quote I'd like to read by George Washington real quickly here. It says this, quote, "The opponents I expected would endeavor to give it an unfavorable complexion with a view to bias the public mind. This evidently is the case with the writers in opposition, for their objections are better calculated to alarm the fears than to convince the judgment of their readers. They build them upon principles which do not exist in the Constitution, which the known and literal sense of it does not support them in. And this too, after being flatly told that they are treading on untenable ground, and after an appeal has been made to the letter and spirit thereof for proof. And then, as if the doctrine was uncontrovertible, draw such consequences as are necessary to rouse the apprehensions of the ignorant and unthinking." What Washington is referring to there was the tactics of the anti-federalists in their opposition to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And those same tactics are being used against the Constitution, the amending provision, Article 5. And on a personal note, I was one of these persons. I used to oppose the Article 5 convention, claiming it would run away. And I was a victim. I was doing it out of ignorance and not knowing my own history. I was basically just sharing information I received from a group called the John Birch Society with legislators in my state. I live in Maine. And long story short, once I did my own research, I quickly realized that Article 5, the convention mode, the framers were very wise individuals, and they understood that our government, in order to function properly needed checks and balances. And the mode of the convention allows the state legislatures to check the federal government, to propose. It gives the states equal authority to propose amendments. A little bit of history: Congress has introduced over 12,000 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Already this year, they've introduced 24. I counted that this week. All this process does is give the states the exact same opportunity that Congress has taken advantage of 12,000 times. Now, a lot of these amendments are great ideas and great reforms that our country needs that have been introduced in Congress, but they'll never see the light of day because 2/3 cannot agree on passing it. Now, on the other side, the states have never introduced a single amendment under their amending provision. And so all this does is give you the same opportunity. I'm not going to go through all my bullet points. I encourage you to please, I want to address that this is not a constitutional convention. The framers were very clear about that. This can only propose amendments to our current Constitution. There is a lot of false information out there, and if you review my points and the original source documents, you'll see for yourselves that the framers were very clear that an Article 5 convention is a limited convention solely for that one amendment or subject that 2/3 of the state legislatures applied for. So I thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Quinn. Any questions from committee thus far? We've got some more. Okay, thank you. Mr. Quinn, we appreciate it. And
Thank you.
Our next one will be Dr. John Cowan. Dr. John Cowan. He's virtual too. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished senators. I'm John Cowan out of Rome, Georgia. Thank you for letting me come in via Zoom. I am the new chair of U.S. term limits for the state of Georgia. And I have been in that group of 80% of Georgians who support the concept of term limits, but didn't really understand as much of it as I needed to. And so it's caused me to go back and read a lot from the framers and founders. And one thing I found out is there are actually 4 co-equal branches of our government. When they've referred to co-equal branches, they also included, despite in addition to executive, judicial, and legislative, the collective state legislatures were considered a co-equal branch and referred to such. And Article 5 was put in for that reason, that we could serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control federal government. And what this proposal does that Senator Cowsert has described so eloquently, and both of them do, is it serves as a check and balance on our federal government and says, listen, if you guys can't get your act together, and I think we would all agree that they are broken, the states will propose amendments to the Constitution to try to rectify it. And as one of the senators pointed out, there certainly are unintended consequences and things, when you pass legislation, that there are downsides to, and maybe unintended consequences. And that's why we don't just meet one time every 10 years. We continue to meet and rectify those things. I would say in Congress, as someone who ran for Congress, I would say that we need more citizen servant leaders to go up there and at least give it a go. We may not be an expert at it, and it may require 2 or 3 terms to become proficient in it. But I do think if we set new ground rules that say, look, you can't be up there more than 12 years in Congress consecutively, that people are smart enough to figure out that we need to frame and restructure the federal government so that that can be done effectively, so that we don't have to have someone with 20 years of knowledge in order to know where the bathrooms are. We should not have a federal government that is that complicated, that folks such as yourselves in the room who are educated, who read, who actually want to explore new ways of forming a more perfect union, can't get up there and serve the people. And so I would dismiss an argument that it requires someone being up there 20 to 30 years in order to be an effective legislature. I would also say that Ben Franklin provided a great mechanism for term limits in the original Pennsylvania Constitution, state constitution. And that was one where people could serve a certain number of terms consecutively, but then would have to sit out an equal amount of terms. And so that is one thing that very smart people or potential delegates to this convention would consider, that maybe you go serve 8 consecutive terms as a U.S. congressman, and then you have to sit out 4, but you could then run again. So I think there are ways to assuage the issue of loss of intellectual knowledge or someone who really is gifted in this role, allowing them to continue to serve throughout a life course, but not become so entrenched to the point that we are really run in the House and Senate by oligarchs. And that's essentially what we have now. This is an opportunity for the state of Georgia to join 19 to 20 other states at this moment to say we want to have a serious discussion on how we can reform our federal government.
Dr. Cowens,
One final point, as a dove hunter, I prefer to hunt with a shotgun and not a rifle. So I think the more of these potential amendments, conventions that we can call, probably the better off we are in reforming a broken system.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Okay. We are, time-wise, we are running, and I know I've got there. Can I do this and this? I'm going to, I wanted to have a negative, Senator, but I'm like this. We are at a time frame that we are at to do that, and I made a promise to you to hear you. Would you give me 3 minutes with Mrs. Boyles, and then we will do that. Yes. I'll let him address that from that standpoint. Okay, okey-doke. Miss Susie, I'm going to let you have 3 quick minutes, please, ma'am. And I appreciate you being here, and I will let you start, please, ma'am.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for allowing me to speak. I am actually speaking in opposition to this bill, and thank you for, since I only have 3 minutes, saying a lot of what I wanted to say, particularly about term limits. And I'm going to say this quickly about term limits. I am the one who is responsible for deciding whether it's your term limits or whether it is my senators. And we just had an election where we saw 2 of our senators become term limited, our federal senators. But what I'd primarily like to speak to you on is this balanced budget amendment. It sounds very good to people like me. I balance my budget at home. I expect you to balance the budget here at the state. And I'm absolutely appalled by what is going on and what my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, et cetera, could be left with. However, we really wish there was a way we could rein the out-of-control spending of the federal government, but the Constitution is not the problem. The federal government has ignored the enumerated powers listed in the Constitution and spends money on countless things that are not authorized in the Constitution. So like education, if a balanced budget amendment was in the Constitution, it would make matters worse by actually constitutionally freezing federal spending on the enumerated powers. So the only way to balance the budget is to raise taxes or cut spending. There is no requirement in Article 5 BBA applications to require it to limit taxes. Right now, every state receives between 19 and 45% of its state budget from the federal government, according to ballotpedia.org. Georgia received about 36.7% in 2014 of its actual revenue from the federal government. That is listed as an enormous amount, over $14 billion. Would any Georgia legislator vote for an Article 5 convention for a balanced budget amendment, which would result in the loss of over $14 billion? This would put Georgia into a crisis of a huge general loss. Both Republicans and Democrats continue to vote for federal mandates on money. How can we honestly say they support limiting spending when they don't? One alarming tactic that I find in proponents of an Article 5 convention, including the BBA amendment, are now promoting the idea that Congress can aggregate Article 5 applications covering different issues in order to achieve the required 34.
Okay.
Part of the problem with that, if you look at the ones that are mentioned directly in the bill, Illinois, Kentucky.
If you'll be wrapping up, because I need
Okay.
your time's out.
Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Washington have never passed a BBA. So I think, particularly for somebody who not only loves this country, loves my pocketbook, loves our Constitution, I think we are heading down a road that has too many unknowns, particularly the delegates. I'm going to pass this out on, I've appreciated what others have had to say about the framers, but I would like you each to have a copy about this, particularly from my old friend,
Okay.
James Madison.
Okay. Okey-doke.
We went to school together.
Okay. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the time issues. I'll ask where we are in the process. We heard committee. Is there any would like to move forward as far as a motion for this this issue? Any there, or how, what's the pleasure? Senator Hickman. Yes.
Yes, Chairman. I would like to make a motion that we adopt Senate Resolution 28 and Senate Resolution 29.
Okay. I
Proposed
believe
by
those are,
Senator
can we
Calvin.
do that separately, or can we do it together? Yes. Individually. I think we're going to have to do those individually.
Okay.
So I'll let you
Restate it?
restate that. How about that?
Okay. Chairman, I'd like to propose that we support Senate Resolution 28 as proposed by Senator Cowser.
Okay. Is there a
And I'll
second?
make a motion to that.
Second by Senator Hatchett. Any other further discussion? Okay. All in favor? Uplifted hands? 1, 2, 3. Okay. All opposed? Okay. In this case, the chairman gets to vote on that, and I'm going to vote in favor of that. So we'll do that. So Senate Resolution 28 goes and passes there. Senate Resolution 29, is there a movement on that? Yes, ma'am. Number 6. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I actually move that we table this issue until we are able to hear from someone, an equal number of people who oppose it. The hearing, because of time, we're not able to hear equal sides to this issue, and so I would move that we table it until we can hear more people who, a more balanced opinion about this issue.
I'm going to move forth on that from that standpoint. Thank you. Senator Roberts, number.
Under discussion.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
We do have a time crunch, and I believe is the one that the senator's asking to table is the one that Ms. Voiles just spoke to.
Correct.
Was this meeting posted in the proper time that it would be held?
To my knowledge, yes.
According to all Senate rules?
To my knowledge, yes.
Then personally, I would oppose the tabling and moving forward.
Okay.
Personally.
Okay. Good. We're at a vote. We've got I need a vote on the table as far as the tabling of the motion. All in favor, say raise uplifted hands. Okay, so we're 3 there. Okay, and all in favor of or against tabling, hands 3, and I'll make that decision. And mine is the other. If you've got those, and mark those portions. Okay. So we're back now at Senate Resolution 29 from that standpoint. And is there a motion? Yes, sir. Senator Hickman, number 11.
A motion that we adopt Senate Resolution 29 from Senator Cowser.
Okay, we have a second? Second from Senator Hatchett. All in favor say aye, or uplifted hands. All right, 3, okay. And all opposed? Okay, I think we're in unison on all that, this voting as far as that. And I will break that portion, so we'll go on. Okay, that's on Senate Resolution there. Dr. Watson, if I can I bring you to the podium on daylight savings time before it changes on us? And bring us up to speed with our watches on daylight savings time. So you are on, and I'm sorry and thank you for your wait. What? Oh, new bill number. There is a substitute.
Let me take you through that. Is the filibuster over?
You're dealing with LC 46.
I appreciate it. So if you will indulge me, I do have a 5-minute video that I think will sort of give us everybody up to date and answer questions. But let me just, before we do that,
Okay.
if we could, we have, there was a little confusion, but we're going to be on the LC 46041-4S.
Okay.
And that's the one we're going to be on, and I have the new 1 and 2, the official versions there.
Okay.
And simply put, let me sort of let you think about it. The proposal will change us to standard time unless Congress acts to allow us to go to daylight savings time. At that time, we would go to daylight savings time. Right now, we can only make one change, and that change is to go to daylight savings time all year round. Let's listen to Dr. Stan Deaton, and then then I'll wrap you up with the science on it, and then we'll hopefully have a discussion and maybe a vote.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. That time of year is coming again, that dreaded night when you go to bed and move your clock forward and lose an hour of sleep. I'm talking about daylight savings time. It comes back Saturday night, March 13th. and it will last until the first Saturday in November, about 8 months. Now, daylight savings time is on the menu in the Georgia State Legislature. There's a move afoot to put us permanently on daylight savings time. Others want us to be permanently on Eastern Standard Time. The idea is let's stop moving the clock around. Which begs the question, of course, where does the whole idea of daylight savings time come from? Where did it come from? What does it mean to save daylight? How long have we been doing it? And what does it mean practically on the ground if we are permanently on either daylight savings time or Eastern Standard Time? Now, it's worth remembering, I did a podcast about 3 years ago about time, the whole notion of time. Where does the 7-day week come from? Why do we have 12 months in a year? Did you know that there's a movement afoot to put us permanently on a calendar that has 13 months, each with 28 days? That would put us at 364 days. We'd have to find that extra day somewhere, but each month would be the same. Mankind has been manipulating the calendar for as long as humans have been on this earth. Not only the calendar, of course, but time itself. Daylight savings time is a movement, of course, in which by shifting the clock forward 1 hour in summer, you make it lighter in the evening. That is, more natural light in the evening through sunlight, rather than have that time in the morning. This notion was first proposed facetiously by Benjamin Franklin in 1784 in an essay, but more seriously in 1895. Once the Industrial Revolution got here, humans began to be concerned with the idea of saving energy. And daylight savings time, by making us less reliant on artificial light in the evening, seemed a way to do that. In 1895, a New Zealand engineer proposed it, but it really gained legs and began happening around the world during World War I. Germany was the first country to implement it nationwide in 1916. The United States did it in 1918 after it got in the war in order to save coal. Now, farmers didn't like it. They liked the morning hours to be a little brighter. Don't care much about staying daylight until 9 o'clock. They do a lot of their work in the morning. The United States went off daylight savings time after World War I, went back on it permanently for 3 years during World War II. Between February 1942 and September 1945, the U.S. was permanently across the country on daylight savings time. That ended after the war. In 1967, Congress passed an act bringing back daylight savings time. For 6 months, beginning with the last Sunday in April through the last Sunday in October, we were on daylight savings time. Darker, brighter evenings, longer. Americans like to do things after their traditional workday is over, outside. The idea was that it gets people to be more active, saves on energy. Now, that whole saving energy theory is open to debate. For instance, in the American South, you run your air conditioner nonstop in the summertime, and the longer the sun is up, the hotter it is, and the more you run your air conditioner. But still, people seem to like the longer daylight hours into the evening. What would it mean to be on daylight savings time permanently? Well, I'll use Savannah as an example. In the height of winter here, we have about 10 hours of daylight. At the height of summer, we have about 14 hours of daylight. And it doesn't matter how you manipulate the clock, you're not going to get more hours. There's a finite amount of daylight. So it all depends on how you shift the clock as to where that daylight is. Right now, at the height of winter, while we are on Eastern Standard Time, the sun sets at 5:20. If you didn't change the time backward in November, that sunset would be at 6:20 on daylight savings time. Sounds pretty good. Sunrise, on the other hand, right now at its latest point is at about 7:20 in the morning. If you stayed on daylight savings time permanently, the sunrise would be at almost 8:30 in the morning. Very dark winter mornings if you stay on daylight savings time year-round. Conversely, in the summertime right now, while we're on daylight savings time, the sun rises at about 6:20 in the morning. If you didn't move the clock forward 1 hour in March and stayed on Eastern Standard Time, the sunrise would be at 5:20 in the morning. Sunset, which is now at about 8:30 here in Savannah, would be at 7:30. What that would mean is that in the summertime, it would begin to get daylight at about 5 a.m. when most people are still asleep, and it would get dark completely by 8 o'clock at night. So if you stay on Eastern Standard Time, you get brighter mornings in the summer and brighter mornings in the winter. If you stay on daylight savings time, you get bright evenings in the summer and very dark mornings in the winter. And in fact, in countries where daylight savings time has been where they've gone to it permanently, after several years, they usually go back either to standard time or a mixture because they don't like the dark winter mornings. Something for us to ponder, and it sounds like Georgians are going to get the chance to vote on this pretty soon. Daylight savings time, all the time, Eastern Standard Time, or keep moving the clock backward and forward. Whatever happens, remember, this has been going on for a very long time and is not likely to be the end of it here. Stay safe, stay strong, and stay awake. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.
All right, Senator Watson, you're going to bring us up on the time, correct?
Right. So it is a little dated. I've had several proposals. Started this last year. Pandemic sort of got in the way. It may still be in the way this year, but we're charging forward. Most people want to stay on the same time all year round. Let's look at a little bit of the logic related to that. And in your folder, you'll see the most compelling piece of evidence is that there's an increase in heart attacks in the spring for about a 2-week period. And that's statistically significant. And to me, you're having more heart attacks and an increased risk of death related to that. You'll see on the second page is the Journal of Biological Rhythms. That was June 2019. Also about the circadian rhythm that is changed when you change it back and forth. A more fun piece on page 3, you'll see the Association for Psychological Science noted that judges give harsher sentences after this time change in the fall, and that's statistically significant. The most recent and also a compelling piece of science is through the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, and you'll see there that they are advocating, you'll see page as I labeled 4B in the abstract, that they're advocating for no time change back and forth. And it is because of that it interferes with our sleep and again our circadian rhythm or the biology of our cells as we adjust to the time for about a 1 or 2 week period every fall and spring. So the science backs this up. The practical aspect of changing back and forth backs this up. Most people want to go to a daylight savings time year-round, but we're not able to do that by Congress. Will not allow that. So what we can do as the state, we can go to standard time all year round. Now, if you'll notice, I did that. That was my proposal. If you look at the other LC number in there for Senate Bill, the substitute for Senate Bill 100, I had said let's just leave it at standard time all year round. But I understand there may be a compromise in the brew, and I will be the first person to admit here that all of us, hopefully are stirring the pot so that Congress will act on moving one way or the other and allowing us to go to daylight savings time year-round. I think the facts are overwhelming from my perspective that leaving the time as one way or the other is the right thing to do. Whether we go to standard time all year round or go to daylight savings time all year round, I could go either way on that one. What my bill does is go to standard time all year round and will allow us, or it does put us in a stance that if Congress acts, and you know that as well as I know, they may never act on this particular subject, but if they do act and allow the states to go to standard daylight savings time, then we would go to daylight savings time at that time. And that's all it does. It's just a few sentences there, and then the Section 2 tells us how it actually goes to implementing that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Questions from the committee? Anybody? Senator Jackson, number 6. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Senator. I appreciate you bringing this to us, and very much appreciate the data around the increase in heart attacks and things like that, and would support us moving to daylight savings time. My concern with your bill is that it moves us into, it essentially plunges Georgians into darkness for 8 months out of the year by moving us to standard time and forcing our evenings to be darker. So is it just not legally possible for us to be daylight savings times all year long? Is that the issue?
That's correct. So I think the very last page, page 5, is a summary of federal law, daylight savings time exemption. So we cannot move to, the state cannot move to permanent daylight saving time.
Right.
That's federal law.
So then, Senator, how have you considered the economic impact that this would have on Georgia to make our evenings shorter? So all of our parks would close an hour earlier. Folks who like to kind of go out in the evenings and stroll, that would all, and spend money when we're not in COVID times, all of that would end a full hour early. And so I'm concerned that this would have a significant economic impact, particularly in the summertime in Georgia, should we choose to have darkness in the night instead of in the morning.
Right. I mean, you have to use the balance. What do most people want? Absolutely. You have to consider that. It doesn't throw us all into, if you go to standard time, remember you're going to have less daylight in the evening, but you have more daylight in the sun. So the argument with that, and I hear both from my trauma surgeons at Memorial where I practice in the hospital, their concern is not for the geriatric patient that I take care of in the evening strolling. Their concern is for the pediatric patient in the morning that gets run over by the driver in the dark. So it's always both sides on that, and I get it. But I will tell you, the trauma surgeons feel very strongly about the kids getting run over in being picked up by the school bus, more than they care about my patients, the geriatric patients who are strolling in the evening. But it's a good point.
Okay, thank you, Senator Jackson. Anybody else? When you're ready. Okay, Senator Robertson, I'll give you a...
Yes, sir. I would be honored to make the motion do pass on this piece of legislation.
Senator Robertson,
The
okay.
second substitute that was presented to us today.
Which is
Yes.
the LC 460414S, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Is there a second on any of those? Okay, Senator Hickman, we have a second. Any further discussions? None. All in favor? All in favor of LC 460418S? Raise your hand.
No, I'm sorry.
excuse
It's LC 460414S.
14. Okay, excuse me. It's a 14S. All in favor of 14S? Lift your hands. Okay. And all opposed? Okay. Senator West? Yes, one. Okay. And Senator Watson, what time is it? Thank you,
It's
sir.
time to adjourn. Thank you, sir.
Time for adjournment, and we appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for that word on time for adjournment. Appreciate that very much. Thank you, committee, and we are adjourned.